I've got our first witness whenever you're ready.
The defense may call their first witness.
Thank you. We call Dr. Spence.
Actually, sir, can I get you to stop here and I'll swear you in, okay? Raise your right hand. Do you swear or affirm the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Okay, now if you make your way over there, please, and be seated. Ms. Freeze, you can proceed when you're ready.
Your Honor, before I get started, I would offer Defendant's Exhibit T, that is Dr. Spence's CV.
Is that agreeable, Mr. Brown?
It is, Judge. We have no objection.
Defense Exhibit T is admitted.
Please state your name for the court.
My name is Dr. Michael J. Spence, S-P-E-N-C-E.
What is your educational background?
I have a bachelor's degree and a master's degree. Both of those are in microbiology, and both of those are from the University of Texas at El Paso. I then went on to receive a PhD in molecular biology in 1990 from New Mexico State University.
What did you do after you completed your PhD?
I went on to work in what's called postdoctoral research positions. First for 4 years in Vermont at the University of Vermont Medical School. Then I went for 8 years to Boise, Idaho, where I worked at the Boise VA Medical Center. That was all research on DNA, mostly, especially as the years passed, directed towards cancer research.
As part of your research, how many peer-reviewed scientific articles did you publish?
14.
Isn't it true that you have also completed a book chapter on forensic biology DNA?
Yes.
Is the chapter in press as we speak?
I hope so. They've been threatening to publish this for years, but I've been told that sometime early summer it should be coming out via Thomson Reuters West. And the chapter is called Forensic Use of DNA.
So you start in cancer research, is that right?
That's correct.
And you move on to DNA, is that correct?
Yeah, the cancer research was mostly looking at expression of DNA in cancer cells, that sort of thing.
How did you go from cancer research to forensic DNA, sir?
Well, when I was finishing up in Idaho, that would be in 2003, I became interested in what was going on in crime laboratory settings with the DNA. So I started looking around at possible law enforcement positions, and I settled on the Indiana State Police, and they settled on me and hired me and put me into their Evansville regional lab down at the southern end of the state of Indiana.
Did they provide you with any specialized training when you transitioned to the Indiana State Police?
Yes, I was fairly knowledgeable about how to work with DNA from the research, but I had a lot to learn about how things work in a police lab with things such as chain of custody. So I needed to learn about that and how to lay out evidence and look for body fluids, and to do all the specialized steps in DNA typing, which is to extract the DNA and quantify how much DNA is on each evidence item. And then eventually do the typing of the DNA and compare evidentiary DNA to known reference samples and put all that into proper reports and testify if necessary.
So this was lab work with the state police, is that correct?
That's correct.
Now, how long were you at the Indiana State Police?
I was there for 4 years, from May of 2003 until May of 2007.
What did you do then?
I then was interested in going home, and I had a position waiting for me there where I could work as a technical manager for a startup lab that would do outsource DNA that could be for to help reduce crime lab backlogs or to do defense testing. So I came home to Las Cruces, New Mexico, which is where New Mexico State University is, and worked there for 8 months as an interim technical manager before I decided to resign and start the business that I'm in right now.
You still are in New Mexico, is that right?
Yeah, I've been in Las Cruces since '07.
How long have you been employed with your own business then, sir?
I launched my business in February of '08, so it's been a little over 13 years.
Do you exclusively provide consulting services?
Yes, I don't do lab work. I have no lab. So that's strictly what I do, is offer my consulting on all the complexities of what we do with this DNA technology and so forth.
I would assume that there's times where your expertise or your consulting needs follow-up work with another lab. Is that right?
Yeah, there are some instances where there's a request for that to do laboratory work, and I have to make sure that nobody sends me anything. Because if there's going to be actual materials that need to be analyzed, there's various labs, outsourced labs out there, and there's one in the Chicago area that I particularly like. But there are a lot of choices as to where you can get that kind of analysis done where you have a defense situation where they don't have the resources, they don't have the lab of their own. They can arrange to have those materials sent to an outsourced lab and have analysis done.
How many cases have you reviewed as a case as a forensic scientist, sir?
Over 1,100.
How many open DNA cases are you working on right now?
Right now, about 60.
In your capacity, in any of the work that you have done, sir, have you ever been fired, laid off, or resigned for some cause?
No.
You have a website for your company, is that right?
Correct.
That company is called?
Spence Forensic Resources.
Is it just a one-page thing, or what does that look like, sir?
It used to be much more than that, with all kinds of links and information when I first started my business, but I've made it much simpler. It is just a one-page thing that describes what I do and provides information as to how to contact me.
Has a prosecutor ever reached out to you and asked for your services?
Well, with the Indiana State Police, the first 16 times I testified and the casework I did, yes. And recently, the Indiana State Police has contacted me about an old analysis I did in '06, and they might be having me testify in the next couple of months. That hasn't been solidified yet, but as a consultant, no. Typically, it's going to be either defense attorneys, public defense attorneys, or sometimes civil litigants.
Why wouldn't a prosecutor ask you for your assistance on a case?
Well, there would be a possibility of that, but they've got a built-in analyst. When a crime is going to be investigated, it's going to end up in a crime lab, much like the one that I worked at with the Indiana State Police, and they've got somebody already assigned to that, and they're experts. So not only do they get to do the hands-on work, but they're trained to be able to analyze and then testify to their analysis. So there's not that much need to have somebody come in a secondary fashion and review their work.
What options do defense attorneys have for getting a second opinion on DNA evidence?
Well, there's people like me available to get that from. Otherwise, you've got to rely on your biology education from college to school yourself on what you might need to ask crime lab analysts.
So what we've asked you to do is to take a look at the DNA analysis and get kind of a second opinion. Is that right?
Correct.
And would it make sense for us to call the crime lab analyst in Iowa to have them critique their own case?
Well, when I was with the Indiana State Police, that just wouldn't work. If I got a call from a defense attorney, I'd be polite, but I'd tell them to talk to my technical leader if they wanted somebody to critique my case. But it doesn't make sense for me to look at my own casework and critique it. So yeah, they would need to get somebody outside of the crime lab that did the work to take a look at it.
So Mr. Freese and I, we called you and asked for your assistance in this case. Is that right?
That's correct.
And when every case is different, is that right, Dr. Spence?
Yes.
But generally, when a defense attorney calls you, what is it that we ask you to do?
Well, typically they're going to be interested in interpreting what's in the reports. Usually there's going to be either one short report, or in this case there's 4 reports. They want an analyst like myself to look at all those reports, but to go beyond that and also look at all what are called the supporting documents. And I mentioned those steps of laying out the case items and looking for body fluids and extracting DNA, quantifying DNA, and doing all the typing. An analyst like myself, we can look at all those supporting documents just to make sure that everything adds up and makes sense, and there's police reports to look at as well to tie together with the scientific work. So that's typically what I'm being asked to do, is to tie everything together and to make sure that the science makes sense.
So there's checks and balances in place, is that right, sir?
Yes, so within the crime lab you have peer review, for example. You have another analyst who did not handle the case who will peer review the reports and the supporting documents, but I'm doing an added layer of that. When I examine a case, I'm looking at it again as a peer reviewer of all the documents.
Now, your job, Spence Forensic Services, you don't do it just out of the goodness of your heart, is that right?
Sometimes, but most of my cases I'm going to charge fees.
Your company is how you support your family, is that right?
That's correct.
Are you being paid to conduct work for Mr. Freese and I, as well as to testify?
Yes, ma'am.
How do you keep up with emerging technologies when you're not at a lab?
Well, probably the best way that I can do that is what I'm doing is looking at so many cases out of so many labs in so many states. I'm not only just looking at the reports and the supporting documents and all the police reports, but I do look at their standard operating procedures of the various labs. There are DNA technical manuals that describe precisely how they do things, so I can keep up on the evolution of that in various labs and look at that. But there's also in the age of the internet, all the scientific papers that are published relevant to forensic biology and DNA, you can usually get those for free. One example is a service called ResearchGate that I use more than anything else to find these articles and get a hold of them, sometimes directly from the authors. But there's, especially during the pandemic, with a lot of downtime from court, there's a lot of webinars that are available that you can either attend over the internet and see what's going on with a lot of talks that people are giving on forensic biology and DNA, but you can review archived webinars on that. So I do a lot of that, and I think that pretty much covers it, to have all those resources available to keep up with the emerging technology.
How many different laboratories have you reviewed DNA evidence from?
I think it's over 90 at this point.
What about how many different jurisdictions or states?
That's out of 30 different states.
As part of your work, how many times have you been qualified to testify as a DNA expert witness?
The first 16 times were with the Indiana State Police as a representative of that facility where I worked for the prosecution. I've also testified another 129 times. So this is the 146th time, either in a hearing or a trial.
Through your 16 or 17 years of working as a forensic scientist, have you ever been disallowed to testify as to your expert opinion?
On forensic biology and DNA, not once.
Have you been qualified to testify in specialized forensic DNA areas?
Yes, on things such as just the crime scene handling of DNA items, potential DNA items, DNA mixture analysis. There's transfer events that can play into how a case is analyzed, and minimizing contamination within the laboratory. I've testified to all those areas. There's another technology called YSTR testing, which is male-based DNA testing, and I've testified to all those specialized sub-areas which would fall under forensic biology and DNA.
Are there ever any times that a defense attorney has called you and asked for your assistance and you haven't been able to help them?
Yeah, well, there's been instances where I could at least help them to understand what's in the case file, and I'm always able to do that, but there are many instances where there's nothing wrong with the way the work was done. There are no problems or interpretation issues. And just as a gauge, it's less than 15% of the time that I have a case where I'm actually needed to testify.
So it's much more common for you to find no major problems, is that right?
That's correct.
Your Honor, I'd ask this court to qualify Dr. Spence as an expert witness in DNA.
Mr. Brown?
Judge, I don't believe it's necessary to have the court do that. We have very liberal rules on experts. We have no dispute that he is an expert in DNA analysis.
Your request is granted.
When were you first contacted to look at Cristhian Bahena Rivera's case?
That would be the very early beginning of October of 2019.
What did you review in looking at his case?
I reviewed, as I mentioned, there's case reports involved in this instance. There were 4 of them. Most of those were generated in 2018. Shortly after the incident in question, and into the latter part of 2018, and then another report came out right around the beginning of October of 2019. So I review all those reports, and tied to those 26 items that were looked at in those reports are all the supporting documents that I mentioned, all those steps that we do in the crime lab. I looked at all the documentation from that, various police reports, photographs, that sort of thing.
Now, when DNA evidence is submitted, how do you, I guess, find a match or compare it with someone's known DNA?
Well, within these reports, there, as I mentioned, supporting documents. Probably the key documents within there are something called electropherograms. I'll call them E-grams to make it easier on everybody. These E-grams are just the actual data output from each of the evidence items. I mentioned there's 26 evidence items, but you also have references from, in this case, a couple of known individuals, and you do comparisons of what's on the E-grams from those, and deduce, for example, when there's mixtures of DNA, whether a person's DNA is within that mixture or not.
In this case, what known DNA samples were submitted, sir?
There were only 2 that were used for those comparative purposes, and those would be the victim, Ms. Tibbetts, and the defendant, Mr. Bahena.
There were some other samples that were submitted when Ms. Tibbetts was still missing to try to develop a DNA profile. Is that right?
That's correct.
And explain that just briefly for the jury.
Well, in some instances where we have a body that's been found, there might be difficulties in getting a good DNA profile from that person, or verifying that is the right person. So you can take family members and do comparisons to family members to confirm that they're related, and that you're not misidentifying anybody, or you're not getting any of the genetic information wrong. And that was done in this case, and I see that often, especially with homicide cases.
When it comes to examining the results within Iowa DCI reports and checking their conclusions against all supporting documents, isn't it true that one thing that you are looking for is problems?
Yes.
And in this case, did you find any problems with the analyzing of the evidence?
No, just based on what the typical protocols are for doing all those steps of extraction and quantifying the DNA and doing the comparisons. I didn't see any major issues with handling or possible risks of contamination or protocols that were in place that weren't followed properly. I didn't see those kind of problems in this case.
So all the proper protocols were followed, no issues there, is that right?
Yeah, it was typical of most cases, how the analysis was set up and done. It was, there were no surprises there.
There were no major problems, but when you refer to interpretation, first of all, what does interpretation mean for the jury?
Well, typically that's going to be the interpretation of what's on those egrams when you do an analysis of, for example, DNA mixtures that come off of some evidence items. You want to compare those. In this case, we have just the two samples, one from the victim and one from the defendant. Sometimes there can be interpretation issues, especially with mixtures, and there can be some disagreement in exactly how you interpret what's on various items in any case, and I did see some differences in how I would characterize the mixtures.
So the difference of opinion would be the interpretation issues of the DNA evidence, is that right?
That's correct.
And what did you see there, sir?
I saw on various items, just generally speaking, that there were mixtures that could be seen. In some cases, the mixtures were fairly strong profiles, but in some instances, they were weaker profiles. But generally, what a lot of labs within their guidelines, what they do is they get mixtures that are somewhat complex and weak signals, and they just refer to those result comparisons as inconclusive. And in some instances, I wouldn't necessarily call them inconclusive.
In this case, well, first of all, you know, Ms. Tibbetts, we know is a victim of a crime here. You'd agree with that, is that right?
Yeah, that's clear.
And Mr. Bahena Rivera has been charged, so it makes sense that his buccal swab has been submitted. Is that right?
Correct.
So in reference to Ms. Tibbetts and Mr. Bahena Rivera, what are we looking for just with them?
Well, in any case, it's similar to this, where it's simplified. It's just looking at a defendant and just looking at a victim. You're going to typically look at things that are possessions of the defendant. For example, his vehicle is key in this case, or any kind of possessions that would be from any defendant. Things like his clothing or his personal items. You're going to not necessarily be interested in his DNA on his own items. You're looking for foreign DNA, specifically a victim of a crime. You want to look within a car for that victim or any other items from him. Conversely, if you have if you're taking samples from the actual person who's been victimized or that person's clothing, you're not necessarily very interested in their profile there. You're looking for foreign profiles. Specifically, if you see evidence of the defendant there on a victim, on her, or on her clothing, you want to be able to characterize that and identify that presence.
Now, if, and I'm talking about in a hypothetical, we see unaccounted for DNA, does that 100% mean that somebody else was involved in a crime?
It could mean that, but the DNA is not going to tell you that. The DNA is going to only tell you from a specific evidence item whether or not there are those unaccounted for sources of DNA or a source of DNA. It's only going to tell you that they're there within what is a snapshot of what's on that surface. It's not going to tell you the history of how that DNA got there. There's no timestamp that tells you when it came to be there.
But it can tell us if there's an out-of-place individual somewhere near a location of a crime scene that perhaps might have been involved. Is that correct?
Yes, that could be what you're looking at when you see unaccounted for alleles on an item that is in a location like that.
Now, sir, I'm going to direct your attention to the examination of the trunk liner in this case. And I'd ask counsel, State's Exhibit 50 has already been admitted. I'd ask counsel to bring that up and to bring it up on the screen.
We'll get that here in just a second.
We've got it, Scott.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Okay.
I won't make you do my work for me.
That's okay. We can put
Yet.
this up if you want us to. That's fine.
All right, now, sir, with reference to the trunk liner, which was covered in item number 58 that was submitted to the lab, do you have some interpretation differences?
Yes, 58 item, the area 58, I'll call it, can be broken down into various sub-items. Most key is 58.1, 58.2, 58.3, and 58.4. I'm not sure which is which on here, but those were all what were considered possible blood stains, and when a presumptive test for blood was run, those tested positive, those 4 areas.
And what did you find that you disagree as a matter of interpretation, sir?
Well, in the instance of, for example, 58.1, there were 17 unaccounted for alleles. When I just to refer to what I mean by unaccounted for, we have to recall that the only 2 individuals we're comparing this to are the only 2 individuals that were typed in this case, the only 2 references, and those were Ms. Tibbetts and the defendant. Outside of their inventory of genetic markers, what we call alleles, were 17 unaccounted for alleles that had to be from somebody else or more than one other person. And there was a clear indication there was female DNA within there that, once again, we don't want to confuse that might have been Ms. Tibbetts. We're talking about a female other than Ms. Tibbetts.
So what it showed is that Ms. Tibbetts' DNA was clearly in that trunk liner. Is that correct?
Not on that particular place. We're not necessarily certain about that. In the instance of the laboratory interpretation, 58.1 was written off as inconclusive comparisons there. I disagreed with that to a degree, the interpretation, in that there needed to be an added statement, for example, that there were unaccounted for alleles in another source of DNA that was not Ms. Tibbetts.
And did it point to a gender of what that DNA contribution would be?
It appeared to be a female source.
Is there any other interpretation differences that you would have with 58, and specifically with reference to 58.1, 58.2, 58.3, 58.4?
Yeah, when you look at 58.2, there were also unaccounted for alleles. In that instance, it was only 7 of them, but there was a clear overlap between what you were seeing in the unaccounted for alleles on 58.1, where there were 17. When you get to 58.3 and 58.4, there were only 4 unaccounted for alleles that couldn't have been from Ms. Tibbetts, could not have been from the defendant. And there was, when you get down to 4 alleles, it's hard to say there's overlap because it's just a few alleles. A lot of people could carry those. But there was some similarity throughout the 1, 2, 3, and 4 there in Area 58.
Let's move on to item 59. That's another fabric-covered liner area from the trunk of the black Malibu. Is that correct, sir?
That's correct.
And describe any interpretation issues that you have there.
When we talk about Area 59, there were multiple areas that were looked at, but there were 3 particular areas where there was a presumptive positive for blood. So we're not confirming blood here, but there's a clear indication that probably what you're looking at is blood. And those were 58.3, 4, and 5. I'm sorry, I'm saying 58. See, I knew I was going to get confused. 59.3, 4, and 5. On 59.3, there was a mixture, I believe that was called as a mixture of at least 3 individuals, with the stronger profile was clearly consistent with Ms. Tibbetts, and I agree with that 100%. But there was additional genetic information there. In one instance, it was 10. I'm sorry, in 59.3, it was 10 unaccounted for alleles. And so those couldn't have been from Ms. Tibbetts, could not have been from the defendant either. And that appeared to be from an unknown male. Unknown because we only have one male to compare that genetic information to.
Right, so 59.3, there is a DNA source that is from what you believe to be an unknown male. Is that correct?
Yes, beyond the clear, what we would call a major presence of Ms. Tibbetts, there were those 10 alleles, and then also at 59.4, there were 4 additional unaccounted for alleles that showed some similarity to what was in 59.3, but not that clear. And then 59.5, that was very weak, and the laboratory called that inconclusive, and I agree, it was too inconclusive to even work with.
All right. Let's move on to 60, which also is part of the fabric trunk liner. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And what were your findings in analyzing that evidence?
In that instance, once again, using the inventory of DNA from Ms. Tibbetts, the inventory of DNA from the defendant, what unaccounted for alleles were there at 60.1 added up to 14 unaccounted for alleles in that instance. It was a little too iffy to say whether that was male or female. They were very weak alleles, but there were a lot of them, 14.
So you just know that there's another contributor that is not Ms. Tibbetts, correct?
Correct.
And the contributor is also not Mr. Bahena Rivera. Is that right?
That's correct.
Were there similar results from the area of the fabric liner of the door of the trunk? That's item 61.1.
Yes, in that instance, there were, once again, just looking at the inventory of the 2 individuals, there were 5 unaccounted for alleles in that location.
So to summarize, you have no issues with how the procedures were followed or the steps were followed in analyzing the DNA evidence. Is that right?
Yeah, there's no issues with how that was approached. And I forgot to mention, too, on 61.1, it was impossible to tell whether those unaccounted for alleles were from a male or a female.
But when it comes to the details of specific interpretations of E-grams from various items, specifically 58, 59, 60, and 61, you believe that the DCI oversimplified things a bit.
Yes.
I object to these leading at this point.
Sustained. Please rephrase.
When it comes to the details of specific interpretations, and specifically with reference to 58, 59, 60, and 61, what is your interpretation, sir?
I would say that it's typical of a lot of laboratories that they are going to be very oversimplified in interpreting mixtures like that, and a lot of times they're going to be just written off as uninterpretable or not suitable for comparison. And to some degree I agree with that, but I disagree that there aren't unaccounted for alleles that could not be tied to either the defendant or Ms. Tibbetts, that there are other contributors there, and you can even in some instances, as I pointed out, you could deduce that they were likely from a female in one instance in one area, 58, and then there was male DNA in another area that was unaccounted for, and then a few other areas where there were just a few added alleles in there, and it was difficult to say what the gender was of those people, except that they were not Ms. Tibbetts and they were not the defendant.
If a known DNA sample were provided to the lab, could that be compared to see if there were similarities with the samples?
Yes, you can always do a comparison. You could take my DNA and compare it to them. Now, in some instances where the DNA signals that are there are very weak, the comparisons are only useful for what we call exclusionary purposes. You could at least exclude that person is that added contributor. But in some instances where we're up to 17 unaccounted for alleles or 14 unaccounted for alleles, you could potentially do an inclusion of a person if either most or all of those signals do match them. And you could do a statistical calculation that can give weight to that inclusion. But for exclusionary purposes, that's often what we're looking for when we get down to minor alleles within a mixture.
No further questions. Thank you.
Mr. Brown, you may cross-examine.
Hang on just one second, Judge. Dr. Spence, good morning.
Good morning.
I don't think we've ever met before other than just prior to the courtroom. Would that be true?
I think so.
Okay, that's all right. Just to make sure I have this understood with regard to what you do, you don't have a laboratory of your own, is that correct?
I do not.
If you wanted to have any item tested in this case, you would have to submit it to an outside lab like the one you named in Chicago that you utilize. Is that correct?
Yeah, to better characterize that, I would recommend that lab or recommend various other labs that are located in other places, and that those items would have to be secured from whoever has them in their possession and sent directly to those outsources.
All right, very good. And you don't do your own testing?
No, I do not.
And the only the only background that you have with any state crime lab, like what Ms. Scott, who she works for, was in Indiana for about 4 years.
Yeah,
Is that true?
It was 4 years with Indiana State Police.
Okay. So you are aware from reviewing all of the laboratory material that samples were retained for further testing if needed. Is that true?
That's correct.
And that is sticking with DCI laboratory protocols. Would that be true?
But yeah, that's similar to the protocols we had with the Indiana State Police, is to avoid consumption of items.
All right. So, and that's so it can be retested, correct?
Yes.
Either to confirm or disconfirm what the criminalist would have done at the state laboratory here in Iowa. Is that right?
That's the idea, yes.
Okay. Did you request that any of the items that you reviewed in the report be resubmitted to an outside laboratory for any type of testing?
No, I typically don't recommend doing outsourced testing or recommend against it. If that issue comes up, that's where I point out that there are labs that I favor over other labs as being a better laboratory resource for that.
I understand, but you were mentioning with Ms. Fries earlier in your testimony these other items that you were interpreting beyond what Ms. Scott interpreted, correct?
Yeah, when we talk about, there are items that were interpreted by the Iowa DCI, but the interpretations were just a little bit oversimplified and as being inconclusive results.
And would you expect that if you resubmitted those items to an outside laboratory, the same results would have occurred?
Well, I think that there would be, if you're talking about comparison just to the two individuals, I think you would at least expect the same results, but you can never be sure. What the key is that are there other individuals there? Well, there are. We'd have to take reference samples and make comparisons to those. You
have any issue at all with the state crime lab that they followed their own protocols in this case and interpreting what was found in the trunk of the black Malibu?
No, I have no issues with the way that they did their protocols, and as for their interpretations, I've been pretty clear about how I might interpret things a little bit different than the way they did.
It's kind of a tough word sometimes, right?
Sorry about that.
That's all right. So it's your opinion that you would interpret things just a bit differently than Ms. Scott. That's where we're at.
In that there's unaccounted for alleles there, and that's clear that there are.
And would it be fair to say that Ms. Scott's interpretations are fairly conservative when it comes to identifying any person's DNA in the trunk?
Yeah, I think, and that's typical of a lot of laboratories, that they're going to be a little bit non-committal when there are weak added profiles that are present within there.
And certainly your interpretation would be subject to disagreement, is that correct?
That is always the case.
Okay. We were to ask another criminalist that has DNA expertise, they might disagree with what you're saying here today.
They would be free to do so if they felt that was correct.
That your interpretations are a little bit more liberal than the interpretations of the DCI crime lab, would that be true?
I would say that comparing them side by side, it's more liberal to say that there were unaccounted for alleles, but there clearly were. So I find it hard to believe that they disagree with at least that conclusion, that there's added sources there that that they didn't go into in making comparisons because there were only the two references to work with.
Okay. I'm assuming that you are aware of a blood stain that was found on the trunk seal of the black Chevy Malibu. Are you aware of that?
Yes, I am.
And you're aware that that particular blood stain was compared to the known DNA of Mollie Tibbetts?
Yes, that's correct.
And the testimony has been that that DNA that was developed from that blood stain was a match to the known DNA of Mollie Tibbetts. Do you disagree with that?
Oh, I do not disagree with that. I agree fully with that.
And on that blood stain, on that trunk liner that is Mollie Tibbetts' blood, there was no mixture, correct?
No, there was a single source in that instance, yes.
Right. And Ms. Scott testified to the exact same phrasing, a single source of DNA, that you just used. Were you aware of that?
I wasn't aware of what she testified to, but it was in her report.
Okay. So what is a single source DNA profile? Explain that to the jury, please.
Well, just for example, if I were to have a little accident and stab my finger and leave a drop of blood there, especially if this was with the pandemic, a completely cleaned off area right here, and they just took a little bit of that blood, I'd be shocked if it wasn't an absolute single source of just me. So when you have that kind of instance of a very rich source of DNA like blood, that's what you would expect. And if you have no unaccounted for alleles in that sample of the little drop I left there, you would call that a single source.
All right. And that single source DNA profile that is Mollie Tibbetts' blood would give us strong evidence. Would you agree that Mollie Tibbetts was on or in the trunk of the black Malibu?
Well, I think that to be more simple about it, that was a presumptive test for blood. There's every reason to believe it was blood. It was gave a strong profile, like blood would. It was a single source. How it got there, the DNA can't tell you that, only that it's there and it's clearly her DNA. There's no doubt that it's might be somebody else. It's not.
I understand. We have to look at all the evidence in the case to make that determination. Would you agree?
I would agree.
I mean, you're just one part of that, like Ms. Scott is one part of the case. Would that be true?
Precisely.
But the blood certainly associates an injured Mollie Tibbetts with the black Malibu. Would that be true?
I think that that's a reasonable assumption, yes.
All right. And the mixture that's inside the trunk also has the known DNA of Mollie Tibbetts. Is that correct?
In the one case that was 59.3, yes, I fully agree that what we call a major profile in that mixture was consistent with Mollie Tibbetts, and the statistics on that it was a big number, and I have no disagreement with that.
Right. And that certainly, that blood would associate Mollie Tibbetts with the trunk of the black Malibu. Is that correct?
Yes, presuming that that's blood, and I think that that's a reasonable presumption. There's no doubt that that was from her and could have been from an injury sustained to the woman.
All right. And it would associate Mollie Tibbetts' presence inside the trunk of the black Chevy Malibu. Is that correct?
I think that there's potential for that, yes.
And again, the fact that Mollie's blood is inside the trunk would indicate to you or any other expert looking at this that she was injured while she was in the trunk. Would that be true?
I think that would be very plausible, very reasonable, logical assumption.
Concerning your interpretation of the presence of other DNA, you have no idea how that other DNA may have been transferred into the trunk. Is that true?
That's correct. The DNA is amazing technology, remarkable technology, and very sensitive, but it's never going to give you an answer to the question of the history of how something came to be there. or the timing of it.
Right, you might look at other factors and other evidence in a case to draw that conclusion, correct?
Yes, this is where a lot of other factors can be considered to try and determine who that is.
Okay, and you might look at statements that the driver of the black Malibu made in helping to make that kind of determination. Would that be true?
I think that would be pertinent information to consider, yes.
Okay, and you might look at what other witnesses may have said in the case or testified to concerning how or when a person might have been associated with a vehicle. Would that be true?
Yeah, I think that in all cases, whether they're sexual related cases or homicides or robberies, you do want to consider what witnesses say.
All right. Now, the other profile that you're testifying to with regard to interpretation, one of those was female, correct?
That's correct.
That could be Mollie Tibbetts' DNA. Would that be true?
In the instance of the areas on 58, area 58, no, they were unaccounted for alleles that were not consistent with Ms. Tibbetts or the defendant.
Okay, so you can exclude Mollie Tibbetts based upon your interpretation?
There's really no cause to believe that her DNA is in that particular area, 58.1.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. Would that mean another female had been in the trunk?
Oh, there's no way of knowing if that means somebody was in the trunk. It just means the DNA is on that surface that was tested, and I have to remind everyone that what we're looking at is a snapshot of what came off on a swabbing or a cutting from material.
So it could have been transferred in there by another item that had been placed in the trunk at some point in time?
Yeah, it could be direct contact from a person. It could be a transfer event. It could be someone in the trunk. There's no way of knowing how that came to be there. The DNA doesn't answer that question for us.
And the same would be true with regard to what you've identified and interpreted as another male DNA in the trunk. Would that be true?
That's correct. It's the same answers for those.
And again, in drawing your conclusions about this case, beyond DNA, you have to look at all the evidence in the case. Would that be a fair thing to do?
I think, yes, for all the cases I've worked on, you want to look at everything.
So all of it collectively, all the witnesses, all the information, and drawing any conclusion as to what any type of DNA profile was in the trunk, what that might mean. Would that be true? Look at everything.
That's correct. I'm here for the science, but absolutely there's a lot of other factors that you want to look at in any case.
Sorry, just a second. So would it be fair to say that your role here is to solely look at the DNA analysis that was done in this case and offer your opinion with regard to that?
Yes, I would say the forensic biology in DNA, how the analysis was done, and whether protocols were followed and that sort of thing. Yes.
All right. Dr. Spence, let me ask you this. If there was an item in the trunk that blood transferred to that could be removed, could that exclude or include anything in the trunk that may have been touched by that item? Do you understand what I'm asking?
Not really.
Okay, I'm sorry. I'll try again. So if there was an item in the trunk that blood transferred to that could be removed, the defendant could remove that, correct?
Yes, if you're talking about, let's just say, a rag in the trunk. If that was there was blood on that rag, that's something that we all know intuitively that the rag could be removed.
And if there are items in the trunk that were removed, those wouldn't be there for criminalists or investigators to see later. Is that correct?
Yeah, and that's just a logical question. If it's not there, then you can't analyze it.
And lastly, Dr. Spence, would you agree that heat and elements degrade DNA?
Heat is, the DNA is very resistant to heat. It can be, but it's best not for it to be exposed to heat. Moisture can be bad. Sunlight can be bad for DNA. And just a lot of things can erode, rub off, or dilute DNA.
All right, and you're aware of the fact that Mollie Tibbetts was found in a cornfield in rural Poweshiek County on August 21st of 2018. Are you aware of that?
Yes, I am.
And it would appear that her body had been there for several weeks. Would that be true?
That's correct.
All right, and that type of decomposition that would have occurred in this case would certainly degrade DNA. Is that right?
It's going to have a tendency to degrade DNA, to be out in the environment exposed in that fashion. To remove all the DNA, not likely, but it's not going to be very helpful for recovery of DNA.
Have you ever been in a cornfield in the middle of July after a rainstorm?
Probably have been. That's an Indiana thing there. I lived right next to one, so.
It can be fairly humid, correct?
Oh, yeah.
And wet.
Yes.
And all of those things affect the ability to get any type of identifiable DNA from a body. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Dr. Spence, thank you very much. I don't have any further questions.
Thank you, Mr. Brown. Ms. Fries, do you have redirect?
Just briefly. Sir, let's talk first about the single source DNA profile from Mollie Tibbetts' blood on the bumper of the vehicle. You recall talking about that, is that right?
Yes.
And so for that, only Mollie Tibbetts' blood was found there, is that correct?
That's correct.
And so there weren't any other sources to compare to or anything like that, is that correct?
That's correct. It was, with it being a single source, there aren't any unaccounted for alleles.
Now, focusing then to items 59 and 60, those are both inside of the trunk, is that correct?
That's correct. That's my understanding as to how those were located.
And I want to focus to 59.3. That's a cutting that was taken from the fabric liner. Is that right?
That's correct.
And your findings were that one of the profiles was Mollie Tibbetts. Is that correct?
Yes.
But you also found that there were two other DNA profiles that were included. Is that right?
There did appear to be more than one other source, and there were 10 unaccounted for alleles.
The strongest source, were you able to give any sort of opinion as to whether those came from a male or a female?
Those did appear to be from a male, with Ms. Tibbetts not being a male. Then when you see a hint on the electropherogram of a Y chromosome, that's a clear indication that there's at least a male contributor in there.
Now, we have Mr. Bahena Rivera's sample to compare, is that correct?
That's correct.
Did you suggest to Mr. Fries or I that we seek the help of an outside lab?
I can't recall if I did or not. When you're up to 60 cases that are unresolved, it's difficult to recall things like that.
Would a lab be of any assistance if we had no other samples to run against, specifically item 59.3?
No, you'd have to work only with the known profiles that we have from Ms. Tibbetts and the defendant. We already had that. So no, it wouldn't be useful unless we had another reference sample or more than one other reference sample to do comparisons.
So if we had a buccal sample from another known suspect, you could submit that and see if there is a match. Is that correct?
Yes, with so little genetic information there, I wouldn't use the word match, but you can show if there's consistencies there. Or as I said, for exclusionary purposes, 10 alleles would work very well.
So with reference to 59.3, if we had a known buccal sample, you could submit that and at least exclude possibly. Is that correct?
Yes, you could show some consistencies, or you could exclude depending on how the results line up.
What about item 60.1? That's another item that there was a mixture of DNA found. Is that right?
Yes, and in that instance, there were 14 unaccounted for alleles.
And if we had another known buccal swab of a potential suspect, would that be of use in comparison?
Yeah, if you had a known reference from anybody, you could do that same comparison and show some level of inclusion or exclude that person.
No further questions.
Mr. Brown, any recross?
Just a few questions, Judge. You would agree that the Iowa Division of Criminal Investigation did not break their interpretation guidelines. Would that be true?
I don't believe so, no.
Okay. And is it safe to say, Dr. Spence, that you would expect another person's DNA in the trunk of a well-used car?
It'd be hard to say for certain. It wouldn't be a surprise to find other sources of DNA in various surfaces of a vehicle.
And are you aware as to the protocols that the DCI crime lab follows in making their comparisons in DNA analysis?
I wouldn't say I'm fluent in that, but that I've looked at so many guidelines from so many different laboratories. I saw nothing unusual about how their guidelines were set up. So there was no real surprise in some instances calling mixtures uninterpretable.
Right. And so it's no surprise to you, and certainly within the realm of the expertise of the DNA analysts at the crime lab, that they will not compare a sample if it is too weak or too complex.
Sometimes they will, and surprise me that they do, and sometimes they won't, and it surprises me that they didn't do a comparison. In this instance, they only had the two references, so with unaccounted for alleles, they wrote those off as uninterpretable, and that's not so unusual to see that.
Okay. And DNA, blood, items where you can develop a profile, you cannot place a time as to when that particular DNA was placed in that particular location. Would that be true?
That's correct. DNA doesn't come with a timestamp.
And again, you have to look at other evidence in the case to make those determinations. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, to at least get an idea, a hint as to what the timing might be.
You have no dispute that Mollie Tibbetts' blood and DNA was on the trunk seal of the black Chevy Malibu that's at issue in this case.
No, I don't dispute that at all.
And you also don't dispute that Mollie Tibbetts' blood and DNA was inside the trunk of the black Chevy Malibu that's one of the subjects of this case. Would that be true?
Yes, we're talking about item 59.3, and that is an interior area, and it's a mixture. That partial profile, it's a near complete profile, was consistent with Ms. Tibbetts, and the statistics on that, I have no dispute with how those were calculated.
So Mollie Tibbetts' blood is inside the trunk?
Apparently, yes.
All right, that's all. Thank you.
Ms. Freeze, are we done with this witness?
Yes.
Okay. Sir, thank you for being here. You're excused.
Thank you.
Members of the jury, at this time we'll take a 10-minute recess. I want to remind you of your admonition. Leave your notebooks where they are, and you may exit at this time. Thank you.